JBS presents the Hampton Synagogue's Author Discussion Series with Rabbi Avraham Bronstein.
My name is Glenn Dorskin. Welcome to the Hampton Synagogue. The Hampton Synagogue Author Discussion Series is a cultural highlight of our summer season, both for members of our congregation and our many visitors from across the Hamptons. I am proud to serve as series chair, and it is my great pleasure to share our past season with you, our global congregation, in celebration of Jewish Book Month. Psalms is not just poetry, it is an urgent lament, a spiritual reckoning, and a reminder that remembrance must always include questioning and moral clarity. Please welcome Menachem Rosensaft.
Glenn mentioned your career in terms of, which is so connected to Holocaust remembrance, not just your biography, but also your career as a lawyer, as a Jewish communal leader. Not everybody who takes on the Shoah as a Jewish communal leader also expresses it creatively. People think about it theologically, philosophically, in terms of the law, in terms of all different things. When did you first find this inkling to express it creatively through poetry?
Well, my first graduate degree was in creative writing from Johns Hopkins, and it really was in poetry and in writing poetry. And that has been my default means of expression. What do I mean by that? The Holocaust cannot be expressed adequately simply in statistics, in historical facts, because it becomes impersonal. And both for the survivors, for the victims who did not survive, there was an element of getting beyond the experience itself and trying to not find sense, because you cannot find sense in that horror, but to try to move beyond the experience itself. And so parables, songs, dreams, nightmares become part of it. And for me, that was the way in which I could actually relate to the Holocaust, to relate to the Shoah most effectively.
So I'm thinking, as you said that, back in the 1970s, Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg, who was then a professor, I think at City College, published a monumental theological treatment of the Holocaust in an article that he wrote. And his essential conclusion is that you can't say anything about it as a theologian. It's interesting that you've managed to find a way through poetry to say something about something that you really can't say anything about because of its magnitude.
Look, I'm a huge admirer of Rabbi Greenberg, of Yitzhak Greenberg, but I'm afraid that the idea of not saying anything is a bit of a cop-out, because it's a way of avoiding dealing with it in theological terms. And I believe we must, both, and there's a difference between dealing with it theologically and dealing with it in the liturgy, which is something we'll come back to. But we must find a way to deal with it, because otherwise, what are we doing? We can't at the same time, and we'll come back to that in discussing the psalm, we can't praise God for performing miracles without acknowledging that during the Shoah there were no miracles. We cannot be in a position of saying, well, a God averted the divine countenance, which is the Martin Buber and to some extent Yitz Greenberg approach, without coming to terms with the fact that, well, if it was a voluntary advertent taking away the countenance and looking away, if that was a voluntary act on God's part, then reversing it and coming back would have been equally a voluntary act. And we at least must acknowledge that it didn't happen.
It's very powerful. I want to think about the title and the mode of poetry that you used. The book is called Burning Psalms. Right? A psalm is a kind of a poem, but it's a very specific kind of poem. And I'm wondering what drove you to write psalms as opposed to a poem? First, and actually, even a better question would be, what's the difference between a psalm and a poem? What are you trying to accomplish with a psalm? And then the second part of that question is, why do you think that is a better way of expressing what you want to express about the Shoah?
Well, the glue that holds Jewish liturgy together is Psalms, is Tehillim. It's there throughout. Mm-hmm. And by the way, not only Jewish liturgy. It's the glue that holds much of Christian liturgy together. And Psalms are, without exception, praise of God, gratitude to God, sanctification of God, extolling God for the miracles performed. And those, to me, struck me as being incongruous in the context of the Shoah. A very small example. In Birkat Hamazon, one of the passages is from Psalms. Nar hayiti v'kam zakanti. I was young and I became old, and I never saw a righteous man forsaken or his children begging for bread. Well, my father steadfastly, from the moment of liberation, refused to say those words because he said, it's a lie. It would have been a lie. He saw too many righteous people forsaken, and he saw too many of their children not just begging for bread, but starving and dying of starvation. And so, to me, I felt that one has to at least confront Psalms. And I had written a number of Psalms over the years relating to them, and at some stage decided, well, let me go through the 150, which is how Burning Psalms came out. It's a reimagining of the Psalms from a post-Holocaust perspective and from the perspective of a son of survivors who lost pretty much my parents' entire respective families, including my mother's son from her first marriage, my 5.5-year-old brother.
I was going to ask you at this point to read one or two, just so we can get a sense of what they actually sound like in practice. But before I do, just based on something else that you said, you'd mentioned the verse that we recite as part of your Birkat Hamazon, right? Nar hayiti v'gam sakanti v'lo re'iti, and how your father couldn't say those lines, couldn't say those words after the Shoah because he had seen too much of that. And you know, and I know, just from the rabbinic literature and from centuries and centuries of Jewish rabbinic commentary, right? Your father is not the first person to have that question, seeing that particular verse. And centuries and centuries of rabbis have tried to either offer answers or framings or possible solutions to make it not necessarily a lie, because that phrase or that that clause, which talks about how God always provides for people who trust in God, has been demonstrably not true, or not 100% verifiably true throughout Jewish history. And I'm wondering, as you're writing an inversion of Psalms, as opposed to maybe a framing or an explanation, the extent to which you think that the Holocaust represents something completely different over the course of Jewish history. In a long series of disasters and calamities, the Holocaust is something else. We can use the regular book of Psalms to get us through crusades and inquisitions and pogroms and everything else that's happened to the Jews through history. But for the Shoah, we can't use the original one. We have to use a new book of Psalms, an inversion. I'm just wondering how you see that.
Look, we know that the Shoah wasn't the first catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
But by all accounts, it was the most devastating, the most horrific, both in terms of numbers and in terms of the savagery of the killing, the systematic murder, the brutality, the totally unrelieving destruction. And to some extent, that requires at least a pause and a different mindset. We can't go on with life, with business as usual after the Shoah. There has to be a recognition and acknowledgement that something has changed, something dramatic has changed.
I think that's a really good setup now for your reading the first psalm that you're going to share with us, just to give us a sense of what they're about in practice, in your own voice. So you said you were going to read number 18 first, right? So just so that you appreciate the context, right? Psalm 18 in the original book of Psalms is a song that King David sings upon being relieved of the stress of being chased after by his enemies. It's a psalm of relief. It's a psalm of God's redemption. So with that context, this is Psalm 18 as reimagined by Menachem Rosensaft.
Benjamin Prezerovich, my mother's son, was 5 years and 8 months old when he was murdered in a gas chamber at Auschwitz-Birkenau on the night of August 3rd to 4th, 1943. A song from the dead, for the shadow, fading reflection of Benjamin, who spoke these words to Adonai on the day that Adonai did not save him from the hand of all his enemies. And he said, I once loved you, Adonai. I believed, I was taught you were my strength, my rock, my fortress where I would be safe, my salvation. Adonai, Adonai, I believed, I was taught you are compassionate, abounding in loving kindness and faithfulness. In my distress I called to you, Adonai, but the ground did not tremble. The world's foundations remained unshaken. You did not roar, did not even whisper. You did not bend the heavens, did not come down from your palace to lift me out of the suffocation. What did I ever do to deserve your silence, your indifference? Was David, who seduced Bathsheba, who sent Uriah to his death, whom you did not allow to build your temple, more faithful than I, more righteous, more blameless? And yet you rescued David from his enemies, but left me gasping for air, gas filling my lungs, on a cold cement floor as the cords of death choked me, overwhelmed me, dragged me to your shoal. No, Adonai, you did not protect me with your shield. Your right hand did not sustain me. You did not set me free, did not hold me, cradle me, comfort me. Therefore, you will not light up my eyes or revive my heart, not even with a rainbow, and I will not sing to you again.
I want to say, because I took the time to read the original psalm before I asked you to read that one, it's striking how closely the words and the phrases mirror the original. The other part that I think for me really comes up as you read is how powerfully these psalms that you've written really capture the essence of the question of the Shoah. Right? Originally, we were discussing in the beginning about what you could possibly say about the Shoah. And what these poems are doing is they're not really saying anything. They're just framing the question, and they're leaving the question there. But at the same time, they're addressing it to God. They're taking the question, leaving it right on God's footsteps, doorstep, as it were. I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, that's the intent. The intent is to engage in a dialogue with God about the Shoah. It is a one-sided dialogue.
Right, God doesn't respond.
God does not respond, but in fairness, as best we know, God has not responded in several thousand years. But that doesn't mean that the dialogue need not take place. Mm-hmm. One of the Hasidic masters, Levi Yitzhak Berdichev, was famous for interceding with God, pleading with God on behalf of the Jewish people, and arguing with God. Well, this is what I believe we need to do if our liturgy, if our prayers are to have any significance.
You had mentioned earlier that part of the motivation for writing these psalms is that Jewish liturgy needed a way of adapting and confronting the questions of the Shoah. And I'd like to press you a little bit on that and ask, what do you mean in terms of Jewish liturgy? Do you intend these poems, these psalms that you wrote, to be used liturgically, like in a synagogue kind of setting? And if so, how do you envision their integration into the liturgy that we already have?
I do not have that much chutzpah or that much of a presumptuousness to believe that my psalms are necessarily the answer. Mm-hmm. I hope they can be the beginning of a discussion. But what is clear to me is that Jewish liturgy has ignored the Holocaust. Yes, I know. Yom HaShoah. Yes, I know that on Yom HaShoah, for those who show up, usually survivors, their children, their grandchildren, and others, there is a moment of remembering the Holocaust and then going on with one's business. And if for those who stick around shul long enough on Yom Kippur and get to the martyrology, there will be a paragraph dealing with the Shoah. But otherwise, nothing. On Shabbat, on the holidays, the festivals, there's nothing. And that is a problem because we are ignoring, for understandable reasons, because it's a difficult topic to confront, but we are ignoring one of the watershed events in Jewish history. The Talmudist David Weiss Halivni said that there were two moments of revelation in Jewish history. Sinai, when God revealed his face to us, and Auschwitz, when God withheld that face. Well, you know, Jewish liturgy, as you know better than I, has not been static over the millennia. Somewhere in the 7th or 8th century of the Common Era, somebody wrote Kol Nidre, and it became integrated into the service. Somewhere in the early 16th century, a Kabbalist in Tzvat, after the expulsion from Spain and Portugal, wrote and composed Yedid Nefesh, and it became integrated into our services. In, I believe, September of 1948, the then Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, Yitzhak Halevi Herzog, the grandfather of the present president of Israel, composed a prayer, Avinu Shebashamayim, which he then had his close friend and not yet Nobel laureate Shai Agnon edit. That prayer, as you know, is now in every service, Orthodox, modern Orthodox, conservative, Reform, and it is a reminder, an awakening of the existence of the State of Israel, of the central importance of the State of Israel to our identity. The Shoah requires the same. It needs to be a part of the liturgy, not just on a day that it's set aside for people who want to show up, but for everyone who sits in shul, and as a reminder that it was there, it happened. 6 million people were murdered. Their ghosts need to be remembered. And what I'm hoping is that these psalms, and of course, I would be thrilled beyond words if one of my psalms were to be the vehicle to accomplish this. But if the psalms do nothing more than start a discussion as to how to do it, where to do it, but it needs to be done. And one of the reasons, by the way, it needs to be done, and it needs to be done now, is that we are at a watershed moment. For the past 80 years, the survivors have been the voice, not just of the survivors, but also of the victims, of the dead. They were the ones who spoke, who reminded us. They were the ancient mariners, talking in almost incomprehensible tongues. Well, the survivors are fading from the scene. And we need to reimagine how we are going to make Holocaust remembrance a part of our religious, theological identity. And that has to be done, I believe, through the liturgy.
So there's two things come up for me when you say that. The first is on Tisha B'Av. You mentioned Yom Kippur. I think almost every synagogue now concludes the selection of keynotes of elegies that we recite Tisha B'Av morning, or maybe even Tisha B'Av evening, with an elegy written to commemorate the Shoah, as if to say the Shoah is the culmination, it's the climax of a long story of Jewish tragedy, of Jewish calamity through the generations, and it has its role as part of that long series of national disasters, so that on Tisha B'Av, which is the day set aside for commemorating all the tragedies of Jewish history, the Shoah has to have its own space in that observance. The other thing that I remembered was 20 some odd years ago, when I was an undergraduate at Yeshiva University on Yom HaShoah. Some of us participated in what was called a Yom HaShoah Seder, which was a ritual program that was composed by Rabbi Avi Weiss, then the rabbi of Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, and he had published it as a small book that we had received copies of, and there were different ritual observances, kind of paralleled on the Passover Seder, but then obviously almost as an inversion, like the Psalms that you wrote. And he argued in the book that the reason why that was necessary was because as lived memory began to fade, Jews preserved things through liturgical memory, by integrating special days on the calendar, by certain observances that become part of the continuum of generations. And that sounds very similar to what you describe in terms of your Psalms, in terms of a liturgical response to perpetuate the memory of the Shoah. I'm wondering if you see what you're doing in the context of those other two examples.
Well, look, I definitely think that including a Holocaust remembrance on Tisha B'Av is appropriate, but it begs a question. It still is, in that case, almost an afterthought. Mm-hmm. It's not the main event. It's while we are already sitting there in mourning, let's add the Shoah to the list of events. I suggest that the Shoah deserves more. As regard what Avi Weiss and what others have done, my difference is I don't want it to be separate. I want it to be a way of having the remembrance integrated not just into a day of tragedy or a day of remembrance, a Yom HaShoah, a Tisha B'Av, or even a martyrology. I want it to be there as a constant reminder, as an open, never-closing sore that we have to deal with, that people have to walk away with. I mean, it is the equivalent of what we do at every Jewish wedding, of breaking the glass in order to remember that there is something broken that we have to have part of our liturgical, spiritual existence.
One more question from me, and then we'll turn it to the audience. One more question from me first. The question is this. Now the book has been out, as Glenn said, since January of this past year, and you've had the experience over the last several months of bringing the book to different communities and different forums, and people have had a chance to read it. And I'm wondering how you react to their reactions. Is there a particular reaction that people have had to these Psalms that has struck you in a particular way, that surprised you, that's been especially meaningful, that's been especially eye-opening?
I am deeply, deeply gratified by the reaction that the Psalms have received and by the really open-minded way in which my motivation for writing them has been received and accepted. And I have to tell you just one quick story and leave it at that. There's a very well-known cantor whom you know, I'm sure, Yossi Malovani, Cantor Joseph Malovani. And he was for many years, until he retired a few years ago, the cantor at Fifth Avenue Synagogue. And I was very nervous about how he would react to the book. And at some point before Pesach, I saw him, we lived near each other, and I said, look, I'd like to give you a copy of my book. I'm not sure how you will react to it. And he took it, and he was traveling to Germany, where he runs a program at one of the universities. And then he called me before Pesach, and he said, Menachem, I read your book 3 times, and I have to tell you, there isn't a word in it I disagree with. And that to me was perhaps the most rewarding reaction, because if I don't mean that it's necessary something that people want to read, but at least that they understand why it was written.
Thank you so much.